At 10:17 a.m. on June 11, 1943, First Lieutenant Thomas Hale held the control yoke of B-17F Flying Fortress 42-29714 level at 12,300 feet 80 miles north of New Britain, with the Pacific visible in every direction and a thin trail of glycol streaming from his No. 3 engine. The airplane's name, stenciled in fading yellow paint on the nose, was Graveyard Shift. 28 missions flown. 2 crews rotated through her. This was Hale's 17th. He was 29 years old, 9 years of flying experience, 3,400 hours in multi-engine aircraft, 0 ditchings, 0 bailouts. Behind him, in the radio compartment, Technical Sergeant Paul Rizzo listened to broken transmissions reporting Japanese fighters forming up over Rabaul. Ahead of them, the low cloud deck hid the coastline they were trying to reach. Between Graveyard Shift and safety, there were at least a dozen Mitsubishi A6M0s climbing to intercept. The Fortress had already been hit once. Flak over the target had torn a section out of the right wing's leading edge between engines 3 and 4. The damage hadn't affected lift significantly, but glycol from a coolant line had sprayed the nacelle and froze in thin arcs that cracked and flaked away in the slipstream. Engine 3 showed slightly elevated temperatures. Oil pressure remained acceptable. They stayed in formation. On the way in, the Japanese had gone for the lead ships first. Standard tactic. On the way out, they targeted stragglers. Graveyard Shift was not a straggler yet, but she was losing power. If you want to see how a heavy bomber stayed in the air after losing the one thing every pilot depends on, his controls, remember this story. It explains how a B-17 that should have gone into the ocean managed to fly, turn, descend, and land with no direct control link between cockpit and tail. 3 hours earlier at 7:13 a.m., Hale had sat in the left seat of the Fortress on Dobodura's pierced steel runway, completing his before-takeoff checks. The target was again Rabaul, Lakunai Airfield. The Japanese had been reinforcing it relentlessly. Previous raids had cratered the runway and destroyed dispersal bays, but reconnaissance showed repair work and new aircraft on the field. The briefing had been straightforward. Altitude, 19,000 feet over the target. Bomb load, 10 500-pound general-purpose bombs with nose and tail fuses. Formation, 3 squadrons in box formation, with Hale's group flying middle element of the second box. Expected resistance, moderate to heavy flak, 15 to 25 fighters. The B-17's control system was not complex in principle. The yoke controlled ailerons and elevator via cables running through pulleys and bell cranks along the fuselage. The rudder pedals actuated cables to the tail. Trim tabs on elevator, ailerons, and rudder provided fine adjustment via separate linkages controlled by wheels and cranks in the cockpit and by manual trim wheels accessible near the radio compartment. All of these components assumed one condition: continuous cable integrity. Hale knew the diagrams by memory. He had studied a B-17's control run on the ground at Langley Field in 1941. Back then, the instructor had put his boot on the cable bundle and said, "If this goes, you don't get a second chance." It had been a theoretical warning. The war turned it into a recurring incident report. In the first half of 1943, at least 6 fortresses in the Southwest Pacific had been lost after fighters or flak-severed control cables aft of the radio room. In each case, the aircraft pitched uncontrollably, either into a steep dive or a nose-high stall, depending on the trim setting at the moment of failure. Crews bailed out when they could. Some never had the chance. The official cause in most of those losses was structural damage/control system failure. Hale had read the reports. So had his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Mark Ellis, 24 years old, 600 hours in type. They both respected the system's vulnerability. They both understood that a single explosive shell in the wrong section of the fuselage could turn the Fortress from a controllable aircraft into a falling object within seconds. At 8:42 a.m., Graveyard Shift had been at bombing altitude 18,700 feet. Approach heading 132 degrees toward Rabaul. Temperatures in the cockpit hovered around freezing. Oxygen masks frosted at the edges. The bomb sight in the nose glittered with ice crystals. The lead ship toggled its bombs first. Hale's bombardier, Lieutenant Caldwell, released on command. The Fortress's nose lifted slightly as the weight left the racks. Hale trimmed forward. Bomb doors closed. They maintained heading for 20 more seconds, then began the standard post-bombing right turn to exit the flak envelope. That was when the first fighters appeared. 8 Zeros came in high from 10 o'clock above the sunline. Their first passes focused on the lead and low left elements. Tracers stitched across the formation. A fortress to Hale's left took hits in the wing route. Fuel ignited. The aircraft rolled slowly out of formation, trailing flame. Hale kept position. He did not have the latitude to maneuver independently. Formation discipline kept everyone alive long enough for mutual defensive fire to matter. Zeros made head-on passes, then broke down and away. Tail gunners in the fortresses reported incoming from 6 o'clock low. More fighters stacked behind the group. Every gun position on graveyard shift opened up. 63.50 caliber machine guns in the group pumped rounds into the sky. At 9:03 a.m., a Zero made a stern attack on graveyard shift from slightly high, aiming for the tail. Staff Sergeant Lewis in the tail turret fired long bursts. The Zero broke off. Another took its place, then a third. One of them fired a cannon round that detonated close to the left horizontal stabilizer. Hale felt the concussion through the seat. The aircraft shuddered. The left wing dropped momentarily. Ellis steadied the yoke. "No visible damage," Lewis reported over interphone. "She's still there." They stayed in formation. Fighters continued to probe the group, looking for weaknesses. 2 more fortresses fell out of formation with smoking engines and ragged holes in their structures. The Japanese concentrated on these damaged stragglers. Standard practice. Multi-engine crews understood the progression. Formation, then straggler, then target. At 9:31 a.m., Engine 3's coolant temperature alarm lit. The flak damage from earlier had begun to matter. Hale reduced power slightly on number 3, compensating with more power on 2 and 4 to maintain position. The fortress drifted slightly out of formation. Hale fought to keep it aligned. Eventually, he could not. At 9:39 a.m., he eased graveyard shift out of the middle position in the second box into a trailing position. The other aircraft noted his movement and closed the gap. It was the right decision tactically. A fortress that could not maintain full power compromised the integrity of the formation. The straggler became bait. Japanese pilots recognized the pattern instantly. The Zeros shifted attention. Graveyard shift's gunners saw them moving. 4 fighters peeling away from the mass of lights around the group, descending to set up a coordinated attack on the single aircraft now sliding farther behind. Rizzo in the radio room heard the change in tone on the enemy frequencies he monitored. He couldn't understand the words, but the excitement and narrowed focus were obvious. The Japanese pilots had found their wounded animal. Graveyard shift flew alone, 1,200 yards behind the nearest fortress, still on the general egress route, but no longer covered by intersecting fields of fire. Hale knew what came next. He pushed the throttles as far as he dared without overtemping number 3. Manifold pressures rose. Engine gauges steadied within the upper end of the acceptable range. He kept his altitude at 13,000 feet, hoping to avoid dropping low into denser fighter coverage near the coastal defenses. The coastline lay ahead, a thin, dark line against the water. At 9:47 a.m., the 4 Zeros attacked in a pincer movement, 2 from high 4 o'clock, 2 from low 7 o'clock. Tail and waist guns opened up. The fortress vibrated with recoil. Tracers laced the air. 1 Zero broke off trailing smoke. Another overshot, its pilot misjudging closure. The remaining 2 made closer passes. One poured 20mm rounds into the left wing. The other aimed at the tail. A single explosive shell detonated inside the fuselage just aft of the radio room bulkhead. The sound was not like the earlier flak bursts. It was closer, less muffled. Hale felt the shockwave through the control yoke. Metal shrieked. Loose equipment rattled. The nose pitched abruptly down. "Hit in the fuselage!" Rizzo shouted. "Radio room's intact, but something aft." The rest of his words drowned in wind noise. Graveyard shift pitched further nose down. The altimeter unwound. 13,000 feet. 12,500. 12,000. Airspeed climbed through 210 miles per hour indicated. Hale pulled back on the yoke. Nothing happened. The control wheel moved freely in his hands, without resistance. The familiar tension of cables and aerodynamic load on the elevator vanished. The yoke travel felt light and disconnected, as if he were turning a wheel attached to empty space. He tried aileron input, left, then right. No response from the aircraft. The wings did not roll. "Controls?" Ellis shouted. "Dead," Hale said. "Elevator and ailerons are gone." He stomped the rudder pedals. The aircraft yawed slightly. Rudder control remained, but the pitch continued to steepen. Airspeed increased. 230 miles per hour, 240. In the radio room, Rizzo saw the change in angle and grabbed onto the table to keep from sliding forward. Behind him, Sergeant Lewis in the tail turret felt his weight shift as the tail lifted. Somewhere between radio room and tail, the shell had exploded close enough to sever the main control cable run to the empennage. The elevator cables, which ran along the left side of the fuselage, were cut. The aileron cables, which passed through pulleys farther outboard, were damaged in at least one span. Trim tab linkages, separate runs, might still be intact, but they were set for level cruise at 13,000 feet, not for a steep dive. The B-17 behaved as a heavy object with its nose forced down by weight and trim, no corrective input available. "Shut it down," Ellis said, meaning the descent, not the engines. Hale ignored the comment. He checked the trim wheels. Elevator trim wheel on the pedestal still moved, but its effect was uncertain. He spun it full nose up. The wheel rotated under his hand. The pitch changed slightly, but not enough. The altimeter passed 10,000 feet. Airspeed climbed through 260 miles per hour indicated. "Everybody to crash positions," Ellis shouted over interphone. "No," Hale said. "We're not done." He keyed the interphone. "Rizzo, check the trim runs. See if you can reach the manual wheel near the bulkhead. Tell me if the cables aft of you are intact." Rizzo clipped his oxygen hose to the portable bottle, stepped into the fuselage, and saw immediately what had happened. A ragged hole, 2 feet wide, had been torn in the left side of the fuselage between frames. Light streamed in. Frayed cable ends hung loose where the elevator control run had been. A scorched pulley bracket sat twisted at an angle. Blood streaks marked the floor where one of the waist gunners had been thrown forward and cut against a bulkhead rib. The manual trim cable run, routed higher along the fuselage, remained intact. "I've got trim cables," Rizzo reported. "Main controls are cut clean through." "Get on the manual trim wheel," Hale said. "When I tell you, crank it." Rizzo moved to the handwheel mounted on the fuselage frame. He braced his feet, gripped the wheel, and waited. The altimeter passed 8,500 feet. The ocean filled more of the forward view. Hale reduced power on engines 1 and 4, left more power on 2 and 3 to see if differential thrust would alter pitch. It didn't. It did, however, begin to bank the aircraft slightly. He noted the effect. "On my mark," he said. "Full nose-up trim aft. Hard and fast." "Ready!" Rizzo said. "Now." Rizzo spun the trim wheel. The cable hummed as it took load. Back in the tail, the elevator's trim tab deflected up. The main elevator surface shifted slightly. The nose of the fortress rose a few degrees. The descent rate slowed. Airspeed stopped climbing. 270 miles per hour indicated. Then 265. Hale held engine power steady. The aircraft was now in a shallow, but still significant downward path. "That's working," he said. "Keep cranking until it stops." Rizzo did. The elevator reached its full nose-up trim limit. The trim wheel resisted further movement. The altimeter steadied near 7,000 feet. The aircraft continued descending, but more gently. The Zeros that had initiated the attack circled above, watching. To them, the fortress looked finished. It had dropped out of formation, then pitched nose down toward the water. The sudden arrest of the dive and partial recovery were not obvious from their vantage point. They made another pass anyway. 2 fighters dove again from high starboard. Tail and top turret guns fired. Tracers laced the air. 1 Zero broke off under fire. The other pressed closer, firing its 20mm cannons. Shells walked up the fuselage, striking near the dorsal turret. 1 shell penetrated the upper skin and detonated inside the ceiling cavity above the wing spar. Shrapnel hit wiring and tubing, but missed critical structural members. Smoke filled the compartment. The top turret gunner coughed, kept firing. Hale felt the impact, but saw no change in control response. He kept his focus on the instruments. They had pitch control of a sort now. Crude, minutely delayed, dependent on a crewman physically turning a wheel in the back. They had rudder control through the pedals. They had no direct roll control. The ailerons responded minimally, if at all, to yoke movement. He experimented with engine power. Increasing power on engines 1 and 2 while decreasing on 3 and 4 caused a slow roll to starboard. Reversing the pattern rolled them port. It was not precise, and the response lagged several seconds behind input, but it was something. "Rizzo," Hale said, "I want you on that trim wheel until we're down. If I say nose down, you spin it forward. Nose up, you spin back. No questions. Copy?" "Copy." "Ellis, call out altitude every 500 feet. You've got eyes outside. Watch the horizon. I'm flying the engines." Ellis nodded, even though Hale couldn't see him clearly through the mask and goggles. "Altimeter 6500. Rate of descent about 300 feet per minute." They had space now. Space meant time. Time meant options. Hale thought in terms of cause and effect. Elevator trim for pitch, differential thrust for roll, rudder for yaw. Those three axes remained controllable, but only through indirect, high-latency inputs. The Fortress was no longer a conventional airplane. It was a platform responding to distributed power and trim changes. The coastline approached. Beyond it lay the jagged hills of New Britain, and farther still, the higher formations of New Guinea. They needed to turn east, then southeast, toward Alliance and Dobadura. "Rudder left," Hale said aloud, partly for his own benefit. He pressed the left pedal. The nose yawed slowly. He adjusted engine power, more on 3 and 4 now, less on 1 and 2, watching for roll. The aircraft banked toward the new heading. They began the turn. It took nearly 2 minutes to complete. Above them, the Zeros watched. They had ammunition to consider, fuel reserves to monitor, other fortresses to chase. The wounded B-17 seemed to be under control, but not climbing or rejoining the group. It was dropping lower, angling toward the coastline. The fighters broke off, returning to harass other targets. At 10:09 a.m., graveyard shift crossed the shoreline at 5,800 feet. Hale held a shallow descent, trading altitude for distance. The crew understood only parts of what he was doing. The waist gunners saw little beyond the holes in the fuselage and the ocean below. The bombardier in the nose watched the waterline rise, then stabilize. None of them saw the cable ends hanging loose, or Rizzo's hands moving on the trim wheel with each command. Ellis continued his calls. 5,500, 5,000, 4,500. At 3,800 feet, Hale reduced power slightly to arrest the descent. The Fortress settled into a new equilibrium. They were too low to clear the higher terrain ahead if they stayed on current course. The Markham Valley lay farther to the southeast, with lower routes through to bases on New Guinea's north coast. "New heading 135, Hale said. "Let's stay over water another few minutes, then cut across where the terrain drops." He coordinated rudder, trim, and engine changes slowly, methodically. The Fortress responded with the inertia appropriate to its weight and lack of direct control surfaces. It did not handle like the B-17 from his training flights. It felt more like guiding a loaded barge with tugboats on each corner. At 10:26 a.m., they began crossing back toward the New Guinea coast. Altitude 2,900 feet. Visibility improved. The inland hills lay under scattered cumulus. The coastline curved away in a broad arc. Ellis craned his neck to look ahead. "If we stay at this altitude, we can make the valley. But landing's going to be—" He didn't finish. Landing required precise pitch and roll control, flare timing, airspeed management, crosswind corrections. All things accomplished in normal circumstances by direct movement of ailerons and elevator. Hale would have none of that. He would have trim tabs and engine power. He considered bailout. The parachutes were on board. The crew could exit at 2,000 feet. Survival over jungle and rough terrain was uncertain, but possible. The B-17 would be written off. The record would show one more loss due to combat damage, control failure. He rejected the option. Not out of sentiment, out of calculation. If they abandoned the airplane now, it would likely fly on into higher terrain or descend uncontrolled over friendly lines. Either way, it would become a heavy, uncontrolled mass, impacting the ground with full fuel tanks and live ammunition. The risk to ground personnel outweighed the benefit. "Negative on bailout," he said over interphone. "We're flying it down." No one argued. At 10:37 a.m., Dobadura's control tower received a short clip transmission from graveyard shift. Ellis handled the microphone. Dobadura Tower. This is Fortress 4, 229714, 10 minutes north-northwest at 2,000 feet. Heavy control damage, limited maneuvering, request straight-in approach. The controller asked for details. Ellis provided only what mattered. No normal elevator or aileron response, relying on trim and power, landing likely to be long and flat. Copy 429714, the tower replied. Runway 3 in use. Wind calm, field clear. Emergency crews standing by. Hale didn't listen to the full exchange. He knew the pattern. Clear the airspace, roll the trucks, wait. At 10:42 a.m., the airfield came into view. He lined up from 5 miles out, adjusting heading with rudder and power. Rizzo held the trim wheel ready. Everyone in crash positions, Ellis said. Loose gear secured. Nose down or back against bulkheads. Don't block the walkway. The crew moved. The top turret gunner dropped into the radio room. The waist gunner sat on the floor, backs braced against structural members. The tail gunner slid forward from his turret into the fuselage. Only the bombardier remained in the nose to monitor altitude visually. Hale reduced power gradually. Airspeed dropped from 170 miles per hour indicated to 150. Too fast for a normal B-17 landing, but normal no longer applied. Rizzo, Hale said, we're going to need nose-down trim in a moment. When I say now, you crank forward 3 turns, no more, then wait. Ready? They crossed the field boundary at about 90 feet. Hale wanted a low, flat approach. No steep flare, no large pitch changes. He aimed to let the airplane fly itself onto the runway using its own inertia. Now, he said. Rizzo spun the trim wheel forward. The nose dipped slightly. The descent steepened by a small margin. Stop, Hale said. Hold. He adjusted engine power. Slightly more on the inboard pair, less on the outboards, to keep the wings level and the nose aligned with the runway. The Fortress sank toward the steel mat. Airspeed 140 miles per hour indicated. Normally, he would have flared at around 110 to 115 in this configuration, raising the nose to reduce the descent rate and settle onto the main wheels. He couldn't do that cleanly now. The trim was already near neutral. Rizzo, half-turn nose up, just a touch. Rizzo complied. The nose rose a fraction. Enough. The main wheels contacted the runway hard. The impact threw dust and smoke from the tires. The airframe groaned. The left wheel struck first, then the right. The B-17 bounced once, then settled. Hale pulled power to idle. Without normal control authority, he avoided using differential braking aggressively. He let the aircraft roll, slowing with aerodynamic drag and gentle, symmetrical brake pressure. They used nearly the full length of the runway. The Fortress came to a stop with its nose pointed slightly to the right of centerline. Its fuselage bore fresh shrapnel holes. The left side opening near the radio room exposed interior structure to sunlight. Control cables aft of the brake hung limp. For the first time since the shell had hit, Hale let go of the yoke fully. It rocked loosely under his hand, unattached to anything capable of moving a surface. He shut down the engines one by one. The crew remained in position until Ellis gave the signal that it was safe to unbuckle. They exited onto the runway, blinking in the bright New Guinea light. Fire crews stood by with hoses ready. Medical staff waited with stretchers. No one needed them. Inspection began within minutes. Maintenance personnel crawled through the fuselage, tracing cable runs. They found exactly what Hale had expected, a clean severing of the elevator and aileron control cables just aft of the radio room. The blast pattern suggested a 20mm shell detonation in that compartment. Shrapnel had sliced through both cable bundles and embedded in surrounding frames. The manual trim run, routed higher, remained intact. So did the rudder cable. The maintenance chief looked at the hanging ends of the main cables, then at Hale. "You flew her like this?" he asked. "With engines and trim," Hale said. "Nothing else." In the debriefing, Hale explained each step. Initial loss of control, trim recovery, use of differential thrust for roll, coordination with the radio operator on hand crank trim. Ellis corroborated his account. Rizzo described his actions at the trim wheel, the feeling of increasing resistance as load built up, the small changes he saw out the nearest window as the tail responded. Intelligence officers took notes. They cross-checked the timeline with crew accounts. They compared it to previous loss reports. In those earlier incidents, no one had tried to coordinate trim and power in the same way. Crews had either bailed out during the uncontrollable phase or attempted to recover using only cockpit trim and power changes without someone physically monitoring the manual wheel. The squadron commander forwarded the report to group headquarters with a recommendation: include training on partial control loss management in future briefings. Emphasize the role of manual trim and differential thrust. Make sure every crewman understood where the trim wheel was and how much it could do. The Japanese pilots who had attacked Graveyard Shift filed their own reports that day, though Hale never saw them. From their perspective, a fortress had been hit hard in the fuselage, pitched over, then leveled out and descended away, refusing to fall. They had broken off to pursue juicier, more predictable targets, ships that rolled into steeper dives and trailed fire from engines or wings. They would not have suspected that the American pilot who kept the aircraft in the air did so with a dead yoke in his hands. In the weeks that followed, maintenance crews replaced the severed cables, patched the fuselage, and returned Graveyard Shift to service. Internally, though, she was no longer just one more B-17. She was the aircraft that had demonstrated an unplanned, unofficial emergency procedure. Hale did not talk about it much. When new crews arrived, he pointed out the trim wheel on the fuselage frame behind the radio room and said simply, "If the controls go, that thing is not decorative. Know how to use it." He flew 8 more missions in the fortress. None involved loss of controls. None required trim-only landings. The report at 5th Air Force Headquarters recorded the incident in neutral, compressed language. Aircraft sustained control system damage in combat. Primary elevator and aileron cable severed aft of radio compartment. Pilot maintained controlled flight and executed landing using engine power, rudder, and elevator trim. No fatalities. Minor injuries only. Airframe repairable. It did not mention the 0 pilots who had broken away, assuming the fortress was doomed. It did not mention Ellis's steady altitude calls or Rizzo's hands on the trim wheel, skin rubbed raw where the metal spokes had pressed under load. It did not mention Hale's choice not to bail out when the altimeter unwound past 10,000 feet in a steepening dive. It did, however, circulate quietly among other bomber groups. In later months, when more fortresses and liberators took hits in their control systems, some crews remembered the story of a B-17 out of Dobodura that had flown with no controls. They looked for their trim wheels. They experimented briefly with engine power and rudder to see what the airframe would do. Most never needed the knowledge. Some did. For them, the example of Graveyard Shift and the morning of June 11, 1943, provided proof that a heavy bomber did not have to become a falling object when the cables went slack. With enough altitude, coordination, and understanding of how power and trim interacted, it could still be flown. Not well, not comfortably, but enough to get home. In the official list of Hale's achievements for that tour, there was no mention of victories. Bomber pilots did not receive kill markers for escaping fighters or flak bursts. His record showed missions flown, tonnage delivered, and sorties completed. The notation next to June 11, 1943 was simple: control failure returned.